Chevre, how are you? I hope everyone is well. Gesund, stark, and freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. Healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually. This week's Parsha is Parshas Chayei. Before we begin with the thought of the week, we'll start with the pasuk from the Rebbe's kapitel, pasuk Kuf Chafei. Avdecha oni havineni, ve'edo edisecho. I am your servant, David HaMelech proclaims. Grant me understanding that I may know your testimonies. This week's Parsha is Parshas Chayei. A major portion of the Seder discusses how Avram Avinu sends Eliezer, his trusted servant, on a mission, and the mission is to acquire a bride for Avram's son, Yitzchak Avinu. The Torah tells us the story, how Eliezer sets on the journey, and then he meets Rivka, and he meets Rivka's family, and then the pasuk says, as Eliezer is recounting what happened to him to Rivka's family, Rashi on the pasuk Va'ove Ayoim brings this famous saying of Arazal, Omer Eb Acha Yafos Ichasen Shel Avdei Avos Lifnei HaMakom. The conversation of the servants of the patriarchs is more pleasing before Hashem mitirasan shel banim than the Torah of their descendants. Shelei Parsha Shel Eliezer Kfula B'Torah V'Harbe Gufei Torah Le'nitnu Ela B'Remiza. Rashi says that the episode of Eliezer's quest to find a wife for Yitzchak is doubled in the Torah. The Torah tells it to us as it happens, and also then Eliezer repeats the entire adventure, so to speak, again to Rivka's family, in contrast to many essential laws of the Torah that were given only by allusion. So this is a very interesting statement that has to be understood. Why is it that Yofas Sichasan Shel Avdei Avos is more precious than Terasim Shel Banim? Why is it that the conversation of the servants of the Avos is greater than the Torah of the children? So there's many explanations, and it's really a huge subject, but we'll give one interpretation that we could possibly say, and that is, on a simple level, maybe what we're being told, without chassidus, let's say, is that there's a concept of yiridus hadoros, the generations get lower. So therefore, even the simple conversation of a servant of the Avos, someone who hung around the Avos and saw their lifestyle, he would have more to tell us, and his words would be more precious than some learning of Torah itself that we're going to hear from people of a next generation, of a lower generation. In Mishonim Kibnei Adam, Anu, etc. In other words, if the previous generation are men, that we are much lower. That idea. So in other words, it teaches us that we have to have respect for those that came before us, even one that was only a servant in the previous generation, he has in him received and contained things that others of later generations don't have. But then what's the message? It seems a pretty depressing message. But hey, I'm from Terasim Shel Banim. So, what does it have to say for us? So, according to Chassidus, there's another message here. And that is connected to the concept of Gedei l'shimusha yoyse milimuda. We could translate as apprenticeship, which could be in shimusha. It means serving, but it also means hands-on experience. Gedei l'shimusha yoyse milimuda. When you actually observe the lifestyle, how Torah is applied by the Avos, and you've seen that, and you've learned from that, that's more precious than just the studying alone. Yafas Sichasen Shel Avdei Avos, because the Avdei Avos saw how Judaism is not only a subject, but a way of life. They saw the application of Torah is more precious than Teirasan Shel Banim, than the actual study and the learning of the Banim, of the children, because they're missing the experience of it. So the lesson in life is very important. And I'll connect it to recently this week, exactly a week ago, Shabbos, Chof Cheshvan, Parshas Vayera, was the passing of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Yud Tes Cheshvan, the day before that, was the yahrzeit of one of my mashpiyim, Harav Agoyin, Rav Chassid, Rabbi Elimelech Tzwibel, called Rabbi Melech Tzwibel. And I thought to myself, what is the common denominator? What do I see that was common in both of these giants of Torah scholarship? Even though one was coming from an academic, secular world, in a certain sense, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and the other was coming from the world of Tomchi Temimim Lubavitch, separate from the modern world. But what was the common denominator? What could I see from both of these giants of Torah? And what I saw was the idea that they were listeners. They were good mekablim. They were good students. I've mentioned this before, the saying of, they say the greatest teachers are the ones who forever remain students. After Elimelech passed away, there was something that was written about him that I found quite amazing. He was a straightforward student, an elevated soul, always did the right thing. In a way you could say square, but that would be wrong. But he was one for, did everything right, wasn't wild, very disciplined, that sort of person. But they said that whenever one from the Elter Chassidim, one of the Chassidim from a previous generation, would arrive in New York in 770, Reb Melech would take off time from Seder to sit and talk with this Elter Chassid. So Reb Melech's a bacher, he's a student in 770, he's in his early 20s, let's say 22, 23. Some Zok and some elder Chassid arrives in New York from Israel, from Paris, from Russia, some Chassid who's in his 70s. Reb Melech would spend days sitting next to this Chassid, milking him, so to speak, hearing from him stories about how life was in the days of the Rebbe Rashab. And I heard that the Hanhola, the administration, his Rosh Hashiva, the Mashgichim, they weren't so happy about it because he was breaking the rules. He was taking off time from normal Seder Nigla. He was taking off time from the regular structure, fixed schedule of learning subjects of the curriculum, breaking the rules and spending the whole day talking to this Elter Chassid. But the administration, his Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Mentlik, didn't disturb Reb Melech. Why? Because since he was such a perfect student when it came to keeping the schedule every other day of the year, so therefore when Reb Melech would break the rules by milking and soaking it all in and absorbing whatever this older Jew had to tell him about the olden days, they let him do it. But this tells you about Melech, Reb Melech. He was always listening, he was always observing, he was always paying attention. And as is known about him, there's many, many stories. He always had a kuntres, some pamphlet of Torah. He was always listening to other shiurim, other Rosh Hashivas, other mashpiyim, always taking in more and more and more. He was always learning from others, absorbing. And since he himself was a genius, so what he had to offer was an unending encyclopedia with non-stop information, which he received from all teachers. That's Reb Melech. And the same thing we have to say about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. It's amazing when you read his articles and you read his books, how he brings together the worlds, the secular world and the mundane world, and examples from art, from culture, from music, from you name it. He does quote a lot of secular sources, which not necessarily is it the room for a regular bacher in yeshiva in Yerushalayim or in New York or Williamsburg or Borough Park or Crown Heights should be reading one of his books. Go learn Gemara. Go learn a Maimer Chasidus. When you get older and you'll anyways waste your time reading other things, maybe then you should read those books. Not that Rabbi Sachs's books are a waste of time. Chas v'sholem, they're genius, they're beautiful, they're gorgeous, they're like nothing else. But it's not pure Torah. I don't know if you have to make a birchas halimud Torah when you read one of his books. And his target audience in those books is to show the beauty of Judaism to those that are on the outside, not on the inside. But what you see is that he never stopped learning. And he took all these mundane secular sources and was able to weave it together to make a beautiful tapestry like nobody else. It becomes something totally original in his hands, all for the purpose of showing the beauty of Judaism and the beauty of Hashem. So that's what we see also from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, his ability to keep on receiving and absorbing from everything that he viewed and saw in life. Talking about this idea of Gedei L'Shimusha Yosem Limuda, I'll just tell you a story that happened with myself. It could be I said this once before. My mother, Ola Shalom, is gekimmen from Minkach. She came from a city called Munkach. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. Anyways, so in my home, when I was a teenager, I'd sometimes sit on the table, with my... So my mother would tell me, "Get up from tish, get off the table. Metunish sitz auf a tish. You're not allowed to sit on the table. A tish is a mizbeach. The table is like an altar. Metunish sitz auf a tish. You can't sit on a mizbeach. A mizbeach referring to the altar, like in the Beis Hamikdash." So my mother would say it all the time if she ever saw me sitting on the table. And I just took it as another thing, My mother told me, you have to listen to your mother. Then when I got older and I was 23, 24, and I learned a Maimer Chasidus where it brought down this Maimer Azal, Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, Mizbeach shel adam mechaper. Bizman she'en beis hamikdash mekayam, shulchan shel adam mechaper. That in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, the altar would bring atonement to man. He'd bring a sacrifice on the altar. But now that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, it's man's table, how he eats, that brings atonement to man. And this Maimer, this discourse in Chassidus, went on to comparing how we eat at the table is the same concept of bringing a sacrifice to Hashem. And talking about the comparisons. So when I learned that in the Chassidic discourse, I thought to myself, look at this. My mother never spent one day of her life in a yeshiva. From where she came from, they didn't have Beis Yaakov for girls. So she never spent one day in a class with a teacher who taught her the study of keeping Jewish law. So there was no sense of academia and scholarship. But what did she have? A mother. And her mother told her, "Metunish zitznav atesh." You can't sit on the table. That's it. She was brought up in the right way. She saw Judaism not as a subject, but as a way of life. And this was engraved in her, and this remained forever. So listen, observe, pay attention. There was once a rabbi. I read a story once about a rabbi, and he was talking about teaching his students. And he writes that, there was a practice in his school, in his yeshiva, that different Rosh Yeshivas would come and give lectures and talks. And then after that, a month or 2 or 3, one of the students would have the job in writing a journal, the student publication, what happened, what transpired in the last couple of months. So he writes, this teacher of the students, that they would call him up many times to ask him, so what happened? What did this guy speak about? Who came? Who visited? And he would always tell them. And his students would ask him, "Rabbi, I don't understand. You have such a good memory. How do you remember everything that happened in the last 3-4 months? Who came, what they spoke about?" And the rabbi would tell his students, "I don't have a good memory. I was just listening. Just listen. Pay attention." This Shabbos is Shabbos in New York of Kinus Hashluchem. All of the Rebbe's emissaries gather together. This year it's more virtual. In this week's parsha, Eliezer says, "Eved Avram Anochi." I am the servant of Avram. This week's Shabbos for us, our generation of Chassidim, we say, "Shliach Harbi Anuchi. I am an emissary of the Rabbi. And what does that mean? Become an Eved, a servant. Become part of a cause larger than yourself. And lose yourself in that cause. And it will be the greatest thing that you can do for your life. This is also one of the lessons in this week's parsha. It's so ironic that Eliezer's name is not even mentioned in this week's parsha. It keeps on saying Eved, Ha'eved, Ish, because that's how he saw himself. Imagine someone coming to a person and saying, "Who are you?" And he says, "Eved Avraham Anechi." Who am I? What defines my being? The fact that I'm on a mission for my master. So too, a real chassid, a real shliach of the Rebbe, his life is about his active role in making his Rebbe's mission a reality in the world. And this is, for every single one of us, a message. Attach yourself to something greater than yourself, to a mission of making the world a better place. Project kindness. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and my mashpia Rabbi Tzwibel, they both had tremendous character traits and sensitivity towards others. And when you're a good student and you observe from the masters and from the giants and learn from them and go in their ways, then you will have a greater influence and impact on others. Bring yourself much more joy because you're involved in a greater cause. Have a much greater impact in the world. And through us dealing with every single person in the proper way, the Eibishter will deal with us, the entire world, in the proper way, and bring the Gula Mitzvah Shlema, take it from Yad, Mamish. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarech, your man in Melbourne.